Hello, my name is Derek Haley. I'm a faculty member at the University of Guelph, and as host, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on discussing the financials related to dairy modernization. I'll say a few more words about this initiative in just a moment, but if I could start, please, with a few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar today. We want it to be available to those who couldn't join us live, and we want people to be able to listen to it later in case there are details that you want to try and capture after the fact. We will keep this webinar to 1 hour. And of course, we welcome your engagement. We welcome your questions. We do ask you to put those into the chat as we go, as they come up to you. And we will address all the questions at the end. There will be time at that point as well for you to ask questions. And you can do that by the React button in Zoom, which will allow you to raise your hand. And at that point in time, if you would like, you can unmute and ask your questions then. If you have any technical problems, please contact Christophe Wand. We'll put his phone number in the chat if it's not already there, and you can drop him a quick text or a call if you're having any issues. Next, just a bit of background about dairy modernization. It is an Ontario-based cross-industry project, the goal of which is to provide practical information to farmers who are considering modernizing their facilities, whether that be a new build or whether that be renovating existing facilities. We are grateful to have funding for this project from the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness and from Dairy Farmers of Ontario. This is the second webinar of our initiative, and we already have the next one planned. Stay tuned. At the end of today's webinar, we will give you information about that next webinar that you can register for, which is slated for March the 12th. Again, the goal of our project really is to help producers navigate the process of making decisions, deciding whether to renovate, to build new, and to help provide resources essentially to help them navigate that process. So we want to try and develop credible, unbiased, and helpful information and resources for you to use to guide you in that process. And we want to do that without overloading you with information because we realize how much information is out there. Now, the Dairy Modernization Initiative is, as I say, an Ontario-based initiative, and it is guided by a steering committee of folks from across the dairy industry that have a wide range of knowledge and expertise, and we acknowledge them here with some of the logos related to those organizations, and we thank them so much for the time and effort and collaboration that they put into our initiative to date. Without further ado, I will turn things over now to Tom Wright, who will be our moderator today.
Thanks, Derek. Appreciate that. And yeah, so this is a follow-up to our December webinar where we discussed some of the higher level things related to modernization from a financial standpoint. And we were pleased to have two of our panelists back today and introducing a new one for the discussion today, just to mix things up. All three of our members here today on the panel are part of the Modernization Financial Committee advisory group. So yeah, maybe we'll just take an opportunity to let them introduce themselves. So I'll start with John at the top here, and yeah, welcome back, John.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Tom. So John Townsend here, Regional Leader Agriculture for CIBC. Been with CIBC for 13 years and with another bank for about the same prior. All the time spent in agriculture and commercial banking, and I lead a team of diverse agriculture relationship managers across a good portion of southwestern Ontario.
Thanks, John. And maybe we'll just jump down to Steve briefly, just because you're a returning panelist as well, Steve.
Hey, everybody, thanks for having me back. Steve Duff, Chief Economist at the Ministry.
And welcome, Mike, to the panel today. So, Mike Menzi, if you want to just give us a little blurb on yourself before we get going, please.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Happy to be here. Mike Menzi, I'm the Senior Director for the Listowel District here with FCC. So I kind of span the counties of Huron, Perth, Grey, and Bruce, and been with FCC for 23 years and come from a dairy and crop background.
Great. All right. So looking forward to this today. I know from our discussion in December when we started off, some of the folks on the dairy side had created this scenario which we used as a kickoff to the discussion. So we're going to revisit it a little bit today. We're not going to dwell on what we did in December much because we do want to get into some of the financials which we didn't get to then. But for those that are new to the webinar series, our original scenario was a farm in southwestern Ontario. Fair number of workable acres, so 250, so larger than a typical farm for the size that they have. Milking cows in a 1990s tie stall barn, so 50 tie stalls. Obviously, overcapacity, so they're jockeying 8 extra cows being milked, so some extra space requirements. They're kind of bulging at the seams. They have 75 kilos of quota. Milk production is around 30 liters per cow per day. It's an older farmer, maybe some health issues, and we're aware of a daughter who's late 20s who wants to take over. So that's kind of the scenario we worked up in December, which was kind of the backdrop for this. Our first webinar covered some of the higher level things, working with an experienced lender and what the advantages of that in terms of it being an ag lender in particular, understanding the long-term goals of the farm and the business. The importance of having those clearly established was a good part of the discussion for that webinar, and the importance of a succession plan being developed so that we understand the parents' goals, the daughter's objectives, building an advisory team, the importance of an accountant. And Steve had talked about with the panel as well the importance of a thorough review of current operations and management. So understanding what you're able to do well and maybe opportunities for improvement with your current situation. Then we started to get into some budgeting for a new facility and then leading up to what you might want to have for a meeting with your lender. So this is literally where we wrapped up in December. Information to have ready before you meet. So we talked about the importance of financial statements, if incorporated, some tax returns, ownership schematic if multiple corporations or some complications were involved, net worth statement, assets, liabilities, milk statements, historical milk production records, so whether you're on DHI or you have some record keeping to understand what's production wise, financial prediction and forecast, especially if you're taking on a lot of new debt. And this is an area where we're going to get into the numbers a bit today. And then if you had gone down the road of actually getting some quotes or you had a budget in mind, it kind of leads us to the discussion today where it's like we're literally jumping to the point where we want to get into some of these financials. And I guess maybe I'll start with you, Mike. So how do you incorporate some of the family's long-term goals into this investment decision?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So it sounds like a few topics were covered at the last seminar already, but just maybe this might be a little of recap some. So really, obviously, the daughter wants to come home. It doesn't mention if there's other siblings involved. So to take every farm situation is different. This one, there's just the one daughter. In any farm situation, there'll be other siblings as well. So for the family to really sit down and have a discussion about how they see their future unfolding, how that cash flow will then look. Are there kids that want to come home over a different period of time? In this case, the daughter, what her time frame would be to actually come home on the operation, what her vision is for that operation as well. Like, is there a growth that she's looking to get to? Is she happy with what the operation is at and just wants to maintain that as well too? And then the lifestyle of the parents. At some point, it's the dad's 57. Obviously, he's got some bad knees. My guess is he's looking to slow down a little too. What are their plans and how might their wages or lifestyle look, and what kind of income would they need to support that as well? And how that potential expansion plays into all those factors, and and factoring in the potential increase in debt and how that impacts everyone's vision as well.
Thanks, Mike. And maybe I'll just come to Steve for some comments there, because I think we just wanted to recap, the importance of understanding the situation before we jump into some of the numbers. So, Steve, any thoughts on this long-term vision that they have?
Yeah, again, I think the key thing is setting expectations, both for the father, for the daughter, and again, Mike pointed it out. It's not outlined in the assumptions, but whether or not there's other siblings, et cetera, that might be involved, husband on the daughter's side, for example, or partner, et cetera. All of those things I think are really quite key, and it does come back to understanding where you want to go and really understanding where you're at. And there's, as you pointed out, there's some things about the operation, we'll see more in a second with the financials, that will have an impact on what you can do in the future and what's reasonable. So taking stock of those things is usually pretty difficult, but I think is key to this whole process.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. John, any thoughts on this? As they say, it's never the in-laws, it's the outlaws.
Absolutely. I think really, I think the two, Mike and Steve, covered off the good part of it there. I think really the big piece is making sure that you have a plan, but also that you're sharing that plan with your lender. Really, what we want to do is we want to be able to be equipped with the knowledge to be able to assist you in achieving your ambitions. So, if it's a modernization project, but we don't know about, dad's going to retire in 3 years' time, and mom and dad need this much income or whatnot, we might not be able to build that into our cash flow considerations and whatnot. So we could be, providing the facilitation in the short term to meet your short term goals, but that might inhibit some of the long term plans that you've got. So really having a plan and having in-depth conversations really enables both the lender and yourself to understand and appreciate that you have the ability to meet the goals that you do have longer term. So.
Okay, that seems like a good jumping off part to get into obviously what we want to get to today is can they afford to do this? So I know you guys have build on to the scenario with some numbers using, different information and experience to create a scenario. So maybe I'll come to you, John, as we talk about whether they can afford to do this. The big question is around debt servicing capacity ultimately. So maybe you could share some of the thoughts around the income statement, whether they can generate enough cash flow to support the borrowing for new facility, and maybe walk us through some of your thought process around this discussion. So maybe just walk people through what you're sharing now and take it from there.
Okay, so I think first and foremost, it's probably good to kind of level set so that our audience kind of has an understanding. What I've got here is let's call it a simplistic income statement, right? If you take a look and you get accountant prepared financial statements, be it compilation engagement or what used to be notice to reader type thing, you're going to see this as your general income statement. We've got this for the fiscal year of 2024. Top line revenue, you've got milk sales, cow sales, etc., accrual adjustments. Really, these are your production type expenses, variable expenses, and gets you, when you take a look at your total income less some of your production expenses, it gets you your gross margin or production margin. From that, you have, your overhead type expenses. And all told, this one, we don't have anything in there for cash taxes, but of course, when you're profitable, you're going to be paying income taxes. So there would be a cash tax piece in there as well. But at the end of the day, what you're looking at here is your net income. So what does this all mean as a customer, as a borrower, as somebody considering a modernization project? Well, really a big piece, and it's a bit of an acronym here. Let's call it cash flow, but the acronym itself is EBITDA, which simply put is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And what that is, it's a measure that lenders use to determine the viability of a business's cash flow relative to what their debt obligations are. In this instance, and I'm not looking for anybody to be able to replicate this. A good lender will be able to go through this with you. But if you've got a grasp at a fundamental level, it's certainly a benefit. We've got net income of 242,000 in this particular example. we've got interest paid of about $9,170, as well as amortization of $64,000. So I'll just note these three cells here. When we look at this, because there is no in this instance, there's no separation between depreciation and amortization, and there is no cash taxes. When we look at this, the operation in itself has generated almost about $316,000 of cash flow. Now, what does that mean? That means, okay, we've got $316,000. How do I know am I going to be able to service things? Some considerations we've got then beyond that is, okay, you know that we've added interest back to determine what your cash flow is. But if you're going to be borrowing, you're going to have to pay interest. So when we look at debt servicing quite simply is EBITDA over principal and interest plus cash taxes. So we know for the year there is about $9,170 of interest paid. We'll reference a balance sheet a little bit later, but I'll quickly flip to it. We can see that there's current portion on the two term facilities, intermediate and long-term loans, as well as FCC loans. In aggregate, we're looking at $37,000 and change in aggregate on principal requirements, as well as another 9,100 and change in interest. So we're looking at somewhere, give or take 46,000 and change in total servicing requirements, plus cash taxes, which aren't broken out here at this instance. So if we've got $316,000 of EBITDA or cash flow, and we know at this point in time, from a servicing perspective, there's only about 46,000. It means that there's about $270,000 of free cash flow that's available right now to service additional debt, and also then to consider, family wages and drawings, et cetera. When we take a look at the income statement in and of itself, there's a couple of things for me that stand out. We've got most of this looks pretty on point, but one of the pieces that I'd have a question about is wages and salary. We see about $5,400. How is the ownership team being compensated? Because it doesn't look like they're being compensated through wages and salary. So is this being done through dividends? And that gets back to, what is the remuneration requirements of the current operation as it sits? What would the remuneration be required of a transition type plan in a succession or retirement? And what is the income generation kind of need from a draws perspective? Because obviously, the 270 that I was talking about there would be called residual available for debt servicing, residual cash flow. Any of those pieces impact the residual that's available to service additional debt. So it's an important consideration there, and that's where, for us, balance sheet strength on a dairy farm, and we'll get into a balance sheet a little bit later. The balance sheet strength is typically there. It's cash flow consideration that's really the driving factor in whether we're going to consideration a modernization event or any other potential projects or considerations for that matter. Cash flow is king. If you're reliant on the balance sheet strength, apart from just some interim support for the odd piece of liquidity here and there, if you can't cash flow, you're going to be selling core assets, and that when you're selling core assets, that doesn't leave you in business too long. So, like I say, the big piece for us is certainly the income statement is the first and foremost piece that's important to the lenders. So, and that's where, like I say, we get into the other considerations of the future planning. What kind of remuneration would the successor need to be paid to operate the operation? What kind of remuneration will the parents need in retirement? Are there any other capital needs coming up? Is there key machinery that's going to have to be upgraded in 3 to 5 years or perhaps longer? Because any modernization project or other project might have a longer time frame. And if we're depending on what we're looking at, depending on the associated costs with a modernization event or other capital expenditures, there might not be sufficient cash flow. So again, really understanding what the capital needs of the business are, as well as the lifestyle and remuneration needs are, is very important. So.
Thanks, John. I'll just maybe I'll come to Mike for some comments, but I just want to mention for anyone following along live today, we've popped a couple of PDF files so you can actually see the income statement and balance sheet as a PDF if you want to open that up, because we're not always going to have it on the screen, but it's there for you if you want to refer to it. So with that, Mike, any comments as well?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. John covered off fairly well. I would say those additional, like, yeah, future plans down the road after the barn is built. Like, yeah, so if you have equipment that's going to be needing to be replaced, we need to factor that into consideration. This proposal here is based on just a new facility for the milking cows. How is the replacement housing looking? Is the tie stall barn going to be converted? Is there a cost needed there? Can you make do with it for a few years till you get your feet under you? And some of those other miscellaneous buildings on site as well. Like, are there anything you're expecting that you'd be looking to do as well? And that's really what we need to be able to factor into the cash flow to try and structure the debt in a manner where you may have a plan where you have some relief that allows you to look towards those future plans as well.
And Steve, as we move from the higher level stuff, now we're into the income statement, et cetera. What are your thoughts here as an economist?
Yeah, again, a number of things. Again, like so, as John mentioned, exactly what the drawings are for this operation is very, very significant, right? They don't have a lot of reported salaries. We didn't say here whether this is a sole proprietor, a partnership, or an incorporated farm. If they're a partnership or a sole proprietor, then they're paying themselves through the EBITDA, right? And so it's effectively drawings, which is covering them as a family, whatever family means here. And I think that really is one of the key things. If they're incorporated, it's curious, right? So, that to emphasize that's significant. And that alone would have a really big impact on that EBITDA calculation, depending on how that plays out. Again, I think looking at the business and how it's structured, right? You've got more acres, as you mentioned, Tom, than sort of a typical farm of that size. You can see that a little bit in the revenue, right? So, the question was some of that land purchased with the objective of to improve cash flow for the farm, and maybe use up some of that additional cash. If you look at the sort of the structure of the farm as far as the efficiency goes, they're quite efficient, and I think that's translating into dollar sales, et cetera. But they're also pushing it in terms of the number of cattle and the current structure and size of their barn. So again, did they grow a little bit that way because cash flow was a challenge, right? And so they're trying to push it within that environment. From my perspective, trying to understand why they've gotten to where they are might have a big impact on what it means their future looks like and how that can fit into their long-term plans. So I think that, again, you can see a bunch of those sort of pieces from this. And again, if you're looking at future expansion, they don't have a lot of debt. They have more land available than they probably need, at least if their focus is purely on dairy production, which might free up some future cash flow for them if they wanted to cut the size of that land a little bit. It may provide them, less work from a management point of view, and maybe that fits better with the daughter. Who knows if she is at all interested in running equipment, all those kinds of things. So again, I think that there's a lot of pieces that, you start to see a little bit more as you get into this, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And maybe I'll come to you, Mike, next for this one. I know we didn't build it into the scenario when you guys were developing this, but maybe the idea of dairy direct payments and their timelines. How does that influence what some of your thinking and what the family's been contemplating around that as well?
Yeah, so it is a good discussion point, and I know it's not included in part of the cash flow. I know when we have discussions with families now, it shows up obviously on their income and expenses as part of the income that comes in and can kind of show an additional revenue. We typically factor that out of the scenario because it's nothing long term that you can count on, but it is a surplus that families are saying, well, I have this now coming in. So it's part of the discussion of saying, okay, we know as the current state that it's going to be whittled down here in the next 3 years and eventually stop as well too. So if the family has been using that for, like in this situation, potentially living costs or things like that, to be able to have a conversation around that, to be able to factor that into the cash flow, and maybe drawings will jump up now because that extra dairy direct isn't going to be available anymore, or maybe it was used to fund some other project as well too. And it's just having that overall discussion about the total cash flow, even though it might not be considered as part of the projections going forward as well.
And John, are you in a similar situation at CIBC with that, or how do you approach those?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, it's not only dairy direct payments. We would look at kind of anything that we would be called non-regularized type income, or for that matter, sometimes expenses as well. Not in this particular scenario, it's not built into it, but if we've got a customer that's done a bunch of tile drainage, that's a one-time non-recurring expense, and it'll show up on the income statement, but we can appreciate on a forward-looking basis it's impacted EBITDA for the year in review or the cash flow. It's not going to recur. So we'll look to back some of that out to say, okay, you know what? Yes, it did happen this year, and if we're measuring covenants, it's included in this year's covenants, but forward-looking or projecting, we're removing any of those kind of extraordinary or what we would consider generally non-recurring type income and expenses, so that we get a true picture of what cash flow looks like on an ongoing basis.
Any final thoughts on that, Steve? Or
No, again, I think everybody's kind of covered it off. It's the degree to which, it's been accounted for in other things that have either maybe improved the productivity of the farm, maybe it's went into investments, which I don't from the balance sheet, it doesn't look like it has. So, again, it's a function of trying to understand how that has affected the past and how you would manage without it in the future, right? And again, it'll depend quite a bit on how it was addressed as the business, and like again, like they've got $51,000 in other farm sales there, right? So that's not an insignificant number, depending on the business structure. So those are the things they're going to have to reflect on as they reflect on the long-term goals for their primary enterprise.
right. I know you guys wanted to prioritize the income statement because it's such an important factor of this, but speaking to the overall financial position of the farm, and you kind of you took us there a little bit, John. Maybe we could just revisit the balance sheet and think of this in terms of what the farm's current financial position is. They're obviously thinking of a huge capital investment here, potentially. So, to speak to us in terms of that kind of discussion as well, please.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to flip here to the balance sheet. When we take a look, and I'll kind of give a quick level set for balance sheet. Assets, of course, anything that you're owning, current assets are considering anything that is cash or will be converted into cash within the year. So feed, crops, let's call it market livestock, something that's not going to be part of your recurring breeding program, inventory, etc. These are, let's call it midterm or long-term type assets, a quota, cattle, heifers, land buildings, etc. It's worthwhile noting that we do have these at market value. So you'll note the 75,000 or the 75 kg at 24,000 a kg is $1.8 million. And the land is at fair market value as well, where typically on your personal balance sheet, they'll be listed at book value. So if you purchase the land and had the buildings that are quite dated, you're probably not going to see these type of values, but just for the sake of illustrative purposes, it's a lot easier. So all told, book value of the assets here for this farm operation is about $9.8 million. They're carrying relatively little debt. They've got some operating debt here, accounts payable that total about 12,000 bucks. And my apologies, I see that this cell, I didn't have the current portions in there, so it should actually total these here. We've got $49,000 of current debt, so anything that will need to be paid out within the year, accounts payable, operating loan should fluctuate, as well as current portion. So any of the regular scheduled term debt, those principal payments that we made for the coming 12 months. Then we've got long-term liabilities here, totaling 178,000. So all told, total liabilities are only 227,000. So when we look at it, they actually have about $9.6 million in equity. So equity, essentially, quite simply put, is if you sold all your assets and paid off all your debt, what you're left with is your equity. So when I look at this as it sits in its current iteration, the farm is quite strong from an overall leverage perspective. So assets, debt relative to equity, you're looking at it's off the charts. It's quite strong. There's very little debt whatsoever. Current ratio here, not surprising for a dairy farm. It's still quite strong. We're looking at probably a little over 2 to 1 on a current ratio. So current assets at 114,000, give or take, over $49,000 of current liabilities. So liquidity is good, debt to equity is good, working capital is good, and it's worthwhile noting when we're looking at working capital or liquidity, we're a little bit more comfortable with things perhaps even being certainly less than 1 to 1 on a current ratio piece, because with a dairy farm, we understand revenue, it's going to be monthly or twice monthly. So, you're not necessarily going to be carrying a lot of accounts receivable. You're not going, inventory is predominantly more of your cattle. There's not going to be quite as much in terms of cropping. So, a current ratio here is again quite strong. So, what does that mean, though, when we consider a modernization project or otherwise? I mean, if we're looking at taking on additional debt, even if you're taking a couple $1 million of additional debt, now you're going to be looking at, let's say for easy numbers, you're looking at $2.1 million of additional debt. Your total liabilities will go up by that same, so you'd be sitting about 2.3 and change in debt. Your equity generally should stay consistent. I won't get into the fray of it too much, but a new barn on a fair market value basis isn't going to contribute dollar for dollar. Like if your farm's worth $2.5 million now and you put a $2.1 million barn on, it doesn't mean that farm is now worth 4.6. Maybe it's worth $4 million. So again, there might be a little bit of an equity swing there on a fair market value basis, but yeah, I mean when we look at this, as mentioned earlier, it remains very strong from a balance sheet perspective, and for most dairy farms, this is the case.
Okay, thanks, John. I'll just come to Mike for some thoughts on the balance sheet as well.
Yeah, similar to John's point about this being a strong balance sheet, his point about the working capital, so your current assets and your current liabilities. Yeah, I would say typically on most dairies we don't see it in the positive. So I would say don't be too concerned if your own numbers don't mirror this one here. We typically do see most dairies below that kind of 1 to 1. So like not having as many current assets versus the current liabilities. And that is because of that monthly milk check that's coming in, which kind of offsets that. So we don't see that they're running into liquidity problems as far as having cash available to make short-term payments, because they have that regular cash flow coming in. So it's a little different than some of the other sectors when we look at it overall. And yeah, to John's point, 100% this balance sheet is well heeled with the amount of debt they have. So from a balance sheet perspective, it does set them up quite nicely to consider options for expansion or a new build. Of course, then you have to combine it with the income statement too, and make sure both those numbers set up. But from a purely equity situation, they're sitting in a great spot to be able to consider options for themselves.
Right. And maybe before we jump into a couple of the scenarios that we've sort of forecast to share with the audience here today, Steve, we've heard the financial point of view in terms of their strong balance sheet. Just refresh us in terms of what is important around overall farm efficiencies before we take a peek at some of these scenarios that we've created.
Yeah, again, I think to echo what Mike and John had said, right? The balance sheet's in a really strong position. That's a great thing. It's a function of a bunch of things, however. It's a function of the business structure they've set up. It's a function of the fact that they basically work light as far as expenses are concerned. From a labor perspective, their production per unit is pretty high. Their labor, per unit seems pretty high or pretty low, relatively speaking. So they've done a really good job, even in a situation where they're maybe not technically the most efficient because of a smaller barn, et cetera, et cetera. So they really have to think hard about what it is they're doing that has contributed to the success, so that they can understand the ability for a modernization project to truly improve that. And as we talked about earlier, maybe the modernization concept here is as much about sort of the personal side of it, the dad's needs, the daughter's interests, which may be different relative to a traditional or more traditional tie style operation. But those efficiencies are pretty clear here, I think. And so, they're going to have to play that into what they think they can get out of this kind of modernization project and whether or not that continues. Because again, you start taking on debt, you start to change this balance sheet in a way. And if you're not achieving that sort of continued success, that will have a negative impact for them. Again, depending on where a bunch of these plans go.
Great. The maybe the next thing we'll switch gears to a little bit is sharing some of the scenarios. So maybe John, if you can kind of walk us through. We created two as part of this. So one is sort of a new construction, and one is that maybe they consider a renovation. So different price points, different considerations along the way. But maybe walk us through a couple of those scenarios a little bit, John.
Okay, sure thing, Tom. So when we look at it, like you said, we've got $316,000 in EBITDA, existing principal and interest requirements of 46,000, give or take. So there's 270,000 residual before remuneration. What we've done here, and Mike was so kind to share in the chat that there is a mortgage app that you can download for your phone, so you can do kind of a mortgage calculator. But this is really just an Excel-based mortgage calculator. So what we've assumed in this instance, if we look at a complete new build here at a cost of approximately 2.1%, because there's more than enough land that we can secure this debt to, we can look at a 25-year amortization. Now, we've plugged in a 6% numerical interest rate in this instance so that we can kind of get a guesstimation of sorts on what annual principal and interest requirements would be. When we see it in year one, principal requirements are about $38,000 on a blended payment basis, and interest of about $123,000. So all told, annual payments, assuming a 6% interest rate, is about $161,000, or 13,400 and change every month. It's important to note here that the current interest rate environments don't actually have us at a 6% interest rate, quite a bit less. But when we look at deals, and I encourage everyone when they're doing their own budgeting and forecasting, run a scenario where you're looking at the current interest rate environment, and it's probably a good idea to look at 2 to 2.5% above what the current interest rate environment is, to give you a little stress test. The big thing is we like to kind of lend to the trend, but we don't want to make long-term decisions, if you will, on a new build that you might be paying for the next 20, 25 years, in this instance, 25 years on. With the current interest rate environment, if it's too tight, or if it's very tight now, and interest rates go up 2.5%, you want to be comfortable that you still have the ability to sleep well at night. So when we look at this, like I said, in our previous scenario, we had about $270,000 of residual EBITDA available to service debt. We have to consider the remuneration pieces and other future plans, but for this instance, there still is available cash flow there if we assume nominal remuneration. We've also looked at another scenario to say, hey, you know what, maybe they don't do a new build at this point in time. Maybe they want to look at seeing how things go. Maybe they want to bring the daughter into some of the management decisions, and they want to pay off their existing debt. I think if we looked at it, there's roughly 3.25 years on the intermediate loans and about 8 years on the FCC loans. So, maybe they want to focus on the interim for some short-term debt repayment. So maybe we're looking at just a renovation and maybe the purchase of a robot to help with some of those labor pieces and dad's bad knees there. Apologies. But this renovation, we want to keep it rather short because from the client's perspective, they're looking at this and they want to keep it shorter so that we can see, what does this mean? Well, in this particular instance, doing the renovation and paying the robot back over 5 years, which there's additional capacity to extend it further, would mean about $185,000 in annual principal and interest payments combined, or monthly payments of about $15,430. Again, that's at a 6% test rate. If we were to drop this back, let's say we put this in at 4% test rate, we're looking now at savings of roughly $9,000 a year on 800,000. A 2.1, obviously, it's going to be significantly different. We see existing annual payments of 161,000. If we drop that to say 4%, well, now all of a sudden we're 132,000. So that dropped, $29,000 and change. So, really what we're looking at here is what do we consider? What's going to be best case scenario for the borrower for their situation? Is it to get the daughter involved in more of the management skill set, maybe not take that big chunk yet to see if she is going to move the operation forward in a manner? Maybe that's good. Maybe that renovation is going to do for quite a time. We don't know. We don't know what the ultimate goals are from a succession piece and what the remuneration of the parents are. We don't have those guidelines at this point in time, but certainly our considerations there. So, um, do you want me to get into the other scenario with a new build and a complete reamortization, Tom, or just leave it at that for right now?
No, maybe I'll just pause there for a second. I'll just ask Mike if he's got any thoughts on these two scenarios and maybe a little more on the idea of the stress testing that you brought up, John.
Yeah, for sure that stress test is important that John ran through with that higher interest rate. I know most people when they look at it, they'll put a slightly higher interest rate in, but it's important to factor in like, yeah, even if the environment is looking to go one way, it can change in a hurry. So definitely important to factor that in. The other thing to keep in mind is, again, if this is for the daughter, going 25 years may not be an issue. Typically what you have to consider too, going 25 years in the whole cash flow at the 15, 20-year mark, that barn's probably going to need some upgrades here and there as well too. So if you're going 25 years, that payment's going to stay that you have in place. So is there a growth mentality in mind from a stress test perspective that's going to free up some cash flow? Or if like 20 years is going to really tighten things up, but then you might be okay being a bit tighter, knowing that you'll have a bit of room to then kind of re-amortize payments again to add in some additional upgrades to the barn when it's needed as well too. So that amortization is as John just showed, can factor in quite a bit too on the amount that the payment makes. But it's really important to take that into consideration. It always sounds great just to push it out as long as possible, but you also have to take into consideration how might your cash flow look at that point when you know you're going to need some upgrades as well too. Now we can't predict the future, but it's worth a discussion point to have all together as well too on that front.
Yeah, that's good. I think the idea that you talked about, John, in terms of the new build reamortization, we probably have a minute or so, or if you want to, take a look at what that looks like, and then we'll start wrapping towards see if there's any questions coming in. So I would just encourage people if there are questions, yeah, we will have time at the end for those.
Yeah. So in the new build and reamortization scenario, what essentially we've done is we've taken the $2.1 million new build and the existing FCC and intermediate loans, and we put them all together. So that those loans would total $2.3 million. And we look to say, okay, you know what does this mean overall? Because the existing debt, let's say, had annual servicing requirements of 46,000 on the new build. Again, let's go back to the scenario where we're at. We're 6% over 25 years. You're looking at 161,000. So you're somewhere around that 205 to $210,000 in annual principal and interest requirements. If we were to take the existing debt together with the new debt and amortize it over 25 years, now you're sitting there about 178,000. So essentially we've alleviated or about 32,000 give or take, 30,000 give or take in surplus cash flow that could be utilized if it should be needed for remuneration to parents, outgoing generation, incoming generation, or alternatively, just provide some interim liquidity so that the operation might build up sufficient cash flow so they could self-fund future quota purchases if they have expansion plans in mind. So again, being very forthcoming with your lender allows your lender to kind of help explore some of the scenarios and say if this is kind of what you're planning on these different steps, it allows us to work a roadmap back to say here's how we need to get there, right? As Mike appropriately mentioned, the barn might be a little tired. And it might need some repairs and maintenance or upgrades before that 25-year mark, and you certainly don't want to have too much debt servicing obligations associated with it. So
I think it's great that we're already worried about what their next barn's wearing out like when we're talking about getting them the idea of into a new one. So Yeah, maybe just as we're heading to the end of our discussion here, Steve, I'll come to you with this one in terms of like, so we started with a scenario with a, I think the lender guys described this as a pretty strong balance sheet farm. What does it look like post modernization if they went, to take on a big capital project like this? What does that look like for their balance sheet and thoughts like that?
Yeah. So again, the current situation is mentioned strong, puts them in a position both from sort of an access to capital perspective as well as the ability to sort of be able to presumably manage some of that. However, it does really hinge on the ability for the farm as they go through this modernization to be able to continue to be efficient, both from a production and a cost point of view, and translate that into high EBITDA, right? So to me, that still remains a question here for a variety of reasons, right? Like the strength in this balance sheet, which I think is stronger than the average farm of that size, from my perspective, is very much likely the function of the dad and whatever is behind the dad, the wife, etc., in terms of their management skills, etc. But we still, again, are looking at this from the perspective of they don't have a lot of wages, so there's a lot of drawings. That has a big impact on then how that plays out in terms of adding debt, because the debt is, as mentioned, is a known thing. So again, that has the potential to add a different sort of set of risks to the farm. But I think they have to be very introspective in what they think they can continue to do as they move into a modernized scenario. Not all modernizations go perfectly initially, that's like any other kind of change. And what might that mean from the cash flow perspective, and how would that then translate into their ability to make this, to think that this kind of balance sheet strength can continue. So again, I think it goes a lot to that idea of looking at what are the efficiencies they think they can achieve. It's not like it's not like this is cutting labor costs, right? Based on the numbers they have available here. So, there's a variety of features there, Tom. But again, they're in about as good a position as you could have, both in terms of the balance sheet and sort of the presumption that there's a lot of good things behind the production, which has led to strength from an EBITDA perspective to build on.
Either to Mike or John, in terms of a comment on what does the future balance sheet look like with a capital project like this?
I know John mentioned it earlier that, it should remain strong. You're adding an asset, you're adding the liability for it as well too, but it's already starting in a very healthy position. So right after construction, I would consider them still having a very strong balance sheet moving forward. To Steve's point, it's that tying in and John mentioned at the start when he was talking about the EBITDA there and the cash flow, like this is an extremely efficient run operation to date. Now you're adding in this extra payment into the mix as well too. They may gain a little efficiencies from a new barn, but because they're already running it extremely efficient, it's not going to be a huge bump they're probably going to see overall on their cash flow. So pretty much the cash flow they got today is probably what they'll be at. Maybe where their efficiencies might lie with a bit of additional cow comfort going to a new facility. They're at 30 liters now. You see that bump up and you'll get that movement on that front. But from a purely balance sheet perspective, I wouldn't have any concerns on this one, even adding in this new facility that they still wouldn't have options to take on other tasks. It'd be the cash flow side that would be probably the limiting factor until things get settled out there.
That takes us to 10 to the hour, where I promised you guys we would open it up for questions. I haven't seen one jump in yet, so I'll take this time while people are maybe contemplating one. Again, just pop those into the chat. I'll leave well, maybe I'll lead into Mike with this question. In terms of, we've talked about the capital project, the modernization, different scenarios in terms of a new build or maybe a retrofit. But if they weren't thinking about going down this road, what are your thoughts around their plan B or their plan C for an operation like that? Because obviously there's impacts for any decision or deferring a decision.
Yeah, I know people I've run into with customers as well too. It's that balance of sometimes they may think, well, we'll wait at this point, and that's perfectly fine. There's an opportunity cost because I've never seen costs actually go down on anything for all of us down the road. So just to be aware, if you're going to wait, that's perfectly fine. Just to get a better idea, maybe the daughter's not 100% sure what she wants to do. Just to take into consideration, there's a trade-off to that because the project will likely cost a bit more down the road too, which could impact the current state. If nothing else changes on this balance sheet, it is in a good spot, but that extra cost is going to eat into that residual that they have as well too from a net income perspective. Um, on the flip side, if you do jump into the project and maybe you don't gain some of those efficiencies you're hoping, yeah, to have a discussion as with your daughter and the rest of the family, make sure you're all aligned as far as what would we do if it doesn't go according to plan, or if the daughter after say 5 years decides this maybe isn't what I do want to do. So it's just having those open discussions as a family, excuse me, and to talk about, okay, if we don't do this, what's the trade-off? If we hold off, are we looking to do it down the road as well too? And then what's the trade-off on costs or how things might look at that point in time?
So I will jump into a question from the chat. So somebody's asking, and it's got a thumbs up, so somebody else is interested in this question. How much do you guys typically see people oversizing facilities? So room to grow for future. So what's your thought around that in terms of lenders' perspective on oversizing facilities?
I can start, John, and you can. I haven't seen one where there's a set
I think John's very
percentage.
grateful you're starting, Mike.
Well, no, I mean,
Yeah, I haven't seen a set percentage of people come to us, nor have we ever prescribed like a set percentage. That being said, we always do have that conversation, and most people do build in, I'm going to say probably a 10 to 20% at the very least factor of being able to grow, because usually there is production increases in the facility, so you already know you're going to be able to increase some just quota holdings alone, but then that usually I have yet to see anyone's just kind of sit tight in what they're doing. So naturally, the cow numbers do start to increase. And so I would say anywhere from that 10 to 20% is kind of at the very least a starting point. Some have more ambitious plans, but that's kind of a range that we see. And John, let you give your thoughts.
yeah, I mean, similar to what you've said, Mike, I don't see a set percentage consistently across the board. It's really dependent on the aspirations of the individual operation itself. But to their point, we typically don't see new builds happening for only the size of the quota holdings that they currently have. I think it'd be short-sighted. So we do see certainly a high percentage of the barns that are being built with future growth aspirations in mind. I think it's certainly important. It'd be poor planning my own perspective unless you're saying this is what I'm looking to do. This is what we're comfortable managing. We're not going to build, but when you're looking at it and you're talking to a builder, the cost to build an additional square feet, isn't the same incrementally more because you've already got your foundation, you've already got, your trusses and everything being made. So the cost to add on or the cost to build it larger rather than adding on, typically people do it up front, although a lot of operations that do have future growth ambitions as well ensure when they are building that they build it with the ability to extend should that be required as well. So we do see a little bit of both there, but again, right at the onset, we do see people building with expansion in mind, even if they are building it with a second stage addition as well. So,
And that triggered a thought too, John, and I know I'm 99% sure you look at it the same way, is that's part of the discussion you want to have as your family is like, is your cash flow going to be left over strong enough that you can make some of those small quota purchases out of cash flow over the coming months? Because typically, once you're in there, say 6 months out, a year out, you'll probably see that your cow production is quite good. You're probably producing more than your current quota holdings, and you're probably going to want to buy some more. So that factor of, do we think we can afford that out of our cash flow, or do we need to talk about putting a additional loan in place for say another 10 kilograms of quota so that you can chip away at that and it doesn't impact your cash flow that way? So that's another factor you want to take into consideration in things as well.
is there more questions that popped in, Tom, or?
Yeah, we got one more, and we've got 4 minutes before I hit my clock. So, how does a lender look at a new venture, e.g., building bigger, so going to fill it with heifers for the U.S. market?
FCC's perspective, we will, if it's completely new venture, I mean, we will do projections based on probably a little more conservative numbers, depending on what you're looking at to ship into the US as well, and try and factor that into the cash flow. Um, I guess the conversation we would have with someone looking at a new venture like that is like, again, when you're looking at the John's numbers he put together in that 20-year amortization or that 25-year amortization, it's, is this something you're looking to do for the next 20 to 25 years? Is this something you're looking to do just because the market's good right now? And so until you have your cow numbers worked up to, like, for milk production, that this is, you're going to supplement it that way. So those are the factors to consider. We will look at it for sure and factor it into projections to a degree. It would also lead to the conversation of, if that market does a complete 180 in a shorter period of time than you're expecting, what is the mitigating factors you have, or the plan Bs to offset that as well too, until you're at that production level in your barn, just from a milk standpoint as well. So those would be some conversations we would have if someone's coming to us with a proposal of a larger bill to do some additional, like, to fill some heifer markets.
Yeah, I think Mike chiming in on that. I think any of the primary lenders will look at it on a case by case basis. I think when you're looking at something that, let's call that a little more niche, um, as you've alluded to, you're going to be looking at kind of different lending fundamentals. If it's a brand new operation, we're going to want to ensure that the balance sheet is appropriately funded, and because the cash flow is kind of unproven, we'll be working off of projections, but we want to make sure that there's significant liquidity held in the background and other abilities, so that way if the market doesn't materialize or does go against kind of what your projections are, that you do have the ability to service the debt, that your principal and interest obligations, without having the bank to require a foreclosure or whatnot. So certainly a lot more scrutiny on something like that. I'm not saying that it's not something that we wouldn't do. It's certainly, there's just more due diligence and certainly a stronger balance sheet that is required to consider that type of funding.
I'll make this the last question, and I'll put it to you, John, because it was just a quick one. Did we calculate this herd's EBITDA per kilo of quota?
So I did myself. I figure it's roughly about $4,300 of EBITDA per kg. But if we do a quick calculation here, I'm just going to go equals the net income plus amortization plus interest gives us our EBITDA. That's the 316,000. If we know that there's 75 kgs, when we're looking at it, we take the EBITDA divided by the number of kgs, and you're about $4,200 of EBITDA per kg. When we're looking at that, as Mike and Steve answered there earlier, 4,200 kg or $4,200 of EBITDA per kg is a very efficient operation. So production efficiencies that may or may not be gained, there may not be as much runway on additional efficiencies with a modernization project.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And thank you. I don't know if there's any final thoughts. We're at the 11 o'clock hour. Really appreciate all you guys participating on this webinar today. Appreciate the audience for their questions as well. And I would remind them, we've got the March 12th webinar coming up from some producer perspectives on modernization. So yeah, any final thoughts? Otherwise, I'll say thanks very much and close it there.
Tom, I've got one
Thanks, everybody.
final thought here.
Yeah.
It's worth mentioning with the strength of the balance sheet and with the, let's call it the surplus land that they've got. There's other options that we haven't really discussed here, both from you could potentially sell 50 or 100 acres of property that you could consider either self-funding some of the debt, or alternatively, if that's going to help provide some retirement capital for the outgoing generation, or if there's other successors that are not going to be operating the operation, so other children that need to be kind of made equal. There are opportunities there. So again, balance sheet strength has really helped this, but again, it's just there's all kinds of options. Just encourage you to understand what your ultimate goals are and have candid conversations with your lenders.
I think that's a great place to leave it, John, because it's always good to remind people the importance of an advisory team and creative ideas. So yeah, different ways to approach things is always good to have different ideas. Thanks very much, guys. I appreciate the audience for staying on to the bitter end, and we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.